All right. Hey, everyone. What's up? This is my first time doing a live stream in the middle of the week, and I've got Danny here as a guest. Some of you probably know Danny, but I'll let Danny, you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and what we're going to be doing today.
Hey, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me, Lance. I have a YouTube channel called Phil Talk. I also do some TikTok stuff. I'm pretty active there doing live streams, but I have interest in philosophy. I mostly do stuff with philosophy or religion, although I have a side interest in metaethics. And so I really look up to Lance, and I'm very honored that I'm here today doing this kind of content. Thanks, Lance.
Yeah, no problem. Let's go with the tropical theme. I like that. It's still summer.
All right.
I think we should stick with that. All right. And then everybody here probably already knows me unless you're seeing this for the first time. So I guess I'll just introduce myself. My name is Lance Bush. I recently finished my PhD in psychology. Pretty soon I'm going to have to stop saying that because it was a while ago now. So now I guess technically I'm Dr. Bush. So I finished a degree in social psychology where I worked in the psychology of metaethics. And before that, did a master's in philosophy at Tufts. And I work in the psychology of metaethics. I also do stuff in metaethics and experimental philosophy more broadly. So it's really interdisciplinary research at the intersection of philosophy and psychology. Most of it is centered on morality, but then I also do stuff that really focuses a lot on the methods used in empirical studies that evaluate how people think about philosophical questions. And often what I try to do is bring a bit of my psychological background to bear on these studies, like the methods, validity, that sort of thing. But then also I'll bring the philosophical considerations to how the psychological research is conducted. Anyway, that is quite a bit removed from much of what we're going to be discussing today, but we decided to jump in and do the stream I think Danny suggested this because it's gotten a lot of attention. A lot of people have been talking about this particular debate or discussion. It's a pretty long discussion that took place, and we wanted to focus on the metaethical aspects of it. So Danny, do you want to tell us more about what we're going to be doing?
Yeah, this is a very long video. It's almost 3-hour debate between Trent Horn, who takes a pro-life position, and Destiny, who takes a pro-choice position. Now, this stream is not about abortion. It's not actually centered around the political issue itself. It's really, we're going to look at certain clips and highlights of the debate that carry certain metaethical assumptions, or in fact, not only that, they address certain metaethical issues, and we wanted to hear them out and respond in some kind of way, whether that we in agreement or disagreement or some kind of critique. So yeah, we're going to be going through these timestamps and giving our thoughts, at least with respect to the metaethical side of the discussion. Yeah.
All right. So is there any preliminary stuff that we should mention? I mean, other than to just emphasize, although the discussion that took place largely centered on abortion, we're not going to be focusing on normative or biomedical ethics or any of that sort of thing. Basically what we're going to be doing is taking snippets of that conversation. I mean, one, because it was too long, and two, just because I like to share my perspective on the metaethical aspects of these discussions, which often emerge and did emerge in this particular discussion, and we're not really going to focus on that other stuff. So if you want to hear more of a normative and applied ethics sort of questions, one, I'm sure there's better content you could get from other people besides me, and two, that's just not what we're going to be doing today.
All right. With that, I did share the stream. The host, it was on the Whatever podcast. The host they introduce themselves, so we don't really need to do any of that. And with that, we'll listen to their introductions. I think it's the first 4 minutes, and we'll get started. Are you ready, Lance?
I am ready.
Okay, here we go.
I am joined today by Destiny, famous internet personality, live streamer, and political commentator, who will be arguing the pro-choice side, or as he prefers, the pro-abortion side. And we have Trent Horn. Trent earned master's degrees in the fields of theology, philosophy, and bioethics. Trent is an adjunct professor of apologetics at Holy Apostles College, and he's the author of 9 books. Trent will be arguing the pro-life side. Thank you guys for joining me. Appreciate it. I think a good jumping off point for each of you, if any of you wish to further introduce yourselves, otherwise we can just get right in. What is your basic stance on abortion. And Destiny, why don't we have you start?
Yeah, so I think that the typical pro-life argument is the idea that we say that life begins at the moment of conception. I believe that there is some kind of life that begins at the moment of conception, but the thing that we're interested in protecting is the human conscious experience. Whenever we talk about a person, we're not usually talking about a body or a collection of cells. We're talking about some other conscious sentient being. Whenever we're talking about pain, suffering, harm, happiness, joy, any of these emotions, we're usually talking about somebody that can experience them as such. When we look at the end of life, the instructive moment is when the person no longer has or is capable of having a conscious experience. So I think when we look at the beginning of life, we should also start at the same point, which is when that conscious experience forms. So my argument is abortion should be illegal at the moment that the fetus is capable of having all of the parts communicating that can deploy subconscious experience, which I read is anywhere from 20 to 28 weeks. So legally, I say probably at about 20 weeks would be the safe point to start protecting that person that's now developed in the womb.
All right. Right. And so my position would be that your value comes not from what you can do, but from what you are, that human beings acquire and lose different abilities throughout their existence. And many of our abilities are also shared by non-human beings that don't have a right to life. Like when it comes to consciousness, there are animals that exhibit levels of consciousness beyond what many humans exhibit, like infants, for example. There are many non-human animals more conscious than them. So I don't think that it's consciousness that makes us valuable. What makes us valuable is that we're members of a kind, of a rational kind, and every member of that kind has equal intrinsic value. So I just think that every human being has equal rights, equal dignity, and that this phrase, every human being, would include every member of the human species. So that begins at fertilization, and then that would end when someone dies, when their body parts no longer function together as a whole. So when their body parts, you begin to decompose, when your body starts to fall.
Okay, we'll stop there. So one of the more interesting phrases that I just heard came from Trent. And there's this idea of what makes something valuable. And he presented some kind of dichotomy, right? Where like, he doesn't think that it's based on what you do, but about how you are. And so it kind of frames the discussion as like, raising questions about the nature of value, where it comes from, what's this concept of intrinsic value? Does it make any kind of metaethical? Do you make any metaethical assumptions if you think there's intrinsic value? What that might mean on an anti-realist position? That's some of the questions that I think were raised by Horn's introduction. What do you think, Lance?
Yeah, I think the one thing that jumps out to me is this notion of an intrinsic value. People will often make reference to intrinsic value. And one of the more interesting things about that is that, one, you don't see it as much as you might expect in the metaethics literature. You'll see people talking about stance-independent moral facts. They'll talk about categorical reasons. They'll talk about the reasons talk in particular has become especially popular. And I'm sure that there's subsets of the literature that talk about intrinsic value, but it's one of those terms that should really jump out at people as it sort of flies under the radar and often doesn't go challenged. But it's the same thing I ask in many other cases where I'm inclined to think that, strangely, philosophy of all the disciplines is a discipline that is supposed to be hyper-reflective, and you're supposed to stop and really reflect on what you mean by the terms that you're using and the concepts that you're employing. And sure enough, there is quite a bit of work on a lot of the relevant concepts in metaethics, but that depth of discussion often is a lot less deep than I think people appreciate when you go and have a look at it. And when you do, it's a lot less clear that whatever depth of discussion you do discover really is at play in a lot of the discussions that you see in more public venues like this one. You'll rarely see people get into the technicalities, and you'll rarely see people really dive in to the meaning of the terms and concepts that they're using. So when people talk about intrinsic value, I think that there's much to be concerned with about whether or not what they're talking about is going to make sense, whether they would be able to cash it out in a way that makes sense. And that isn't even necessarily to say, although I'm very skeptical there's any non-trivial way of making sense of the notion of intrinsic value. It's not to say that you can't, just that typically the people that even invoke these concepts don't do so. And in many cases, I'm not certain whether they could if they were prompted to do so. And so it looks like a lot of people are sort of seizing on metaethical terminology without necessarily employing it. That I don't know, Trent. Maybe Trent has a really developed view on this, but I will flag that term is tossed around a lot, even by people that don't have a background and training in philosophy or related disciplines. But other than that, I mean, this is just sort of setting the stage. So I don't know that I have anything to sort of sink my teeth into beyond that. Do you have anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I've used the term because I'm an anti-realist myself. I've used the term intrinsic value. But I kind of cashed it out in terms of like this distinction between something being instrumental versus like something that's instrumental for some kind of end, some kind of base preference. The idea is that like when I have certain goals or ends that don't reduce further, like it's like I just have this kind of fundamental preference, and that I could use the term intrinsic to reflect that, and think about going to work, going to school as extrinsic, right? Because they further my goal of my more fundamental preference of making money or feeding my family, whatever it might be. So it's not a term that's like, I think it's not like anti-realists can't use these terms. I think there's ways of cashing it out intelligibly, I think in my opinion, the way that I just did. But it definitely raises more questions than it answers when you're having this kind of conversation.
Yeah, that actually prompts a couple remarks. The first is that, yeah, absolutely. You can draw this distinction between things that are instrumentally valuable. Like it might be instrumentally valuable to have a car because it takes you to the places that you want to go. But, unless you're like a car collector or something like that, it's probably not an end in itself to have a car for most people most of the time. It's a tool. And the same thing generally for a lot of the tools that we have. The tools we have are like, I don't value cups for their own sake. I value cups because they hold the things I put in them to drink. And I don't even necessarily value the drink for its own sake. I value the drink because it keeps me hydrated, because I want to be alive and I value being alive. So you could certainly draw this distinction between things that have value insofar as they facilitate our more ultimate ends. And then what you could say, you could use the term intrinsic value to refer to them. I like the term terminal value, or you could say ultimate value, or fundamental value. There's a lot of terminology that you could use. One of the things I want to add to that, though, is that it's interesting that philosophers have never really sat down and sort of hammered out consistent shared terminology. And I think that that's something that I think I saw clips of this where they may have used terms like absolute, and I've seen other discussions where people use terms like universal, and these terms get thrown around a lot in a way that is consistently conflated in discussions in normative and metaethics, where people will mistake, for instance, an action, the rightness or wrongness of an action being insensitive to contextual considerations. Like it's always wrong to kill a person regardless of context. They'll often conflate that with it's wrong to kill people independent of anybody's goal standards or values. So they'll conflate exceptionlessness of a moral principle with the sort of truth makers that serve to make it true, whether it's made true by some stance independent fact or made true by a stance, or it's not made true at all. And so what you'll often see is this sloppy inconsistency in terminology that appears in less professional contexts. This one is like, this isn't, because like Trent apparently has some background in philosophy. And again, this is not a critique of anything in the video yet. This is just a general commentary. I think this is more a problem for philosophers. They just have not really worked to get everybody on the same page about consistency in terminology. So again, there's an irony in, and me, I critique a lot of analytic philosophy. I think analytic philosophers have failed as an academic institution to really strive to develop a consistent shared terminology in order to, and I think that this exacerbates and amplifies a lot of the confusions that are out there, and that this percolates in sort of lay discourse and non-academic discourse. And I think that that's really unfortunate. The other thing I want to flag about appeals to intrinsic value is that sometimes people will toss those terms into their discussions. And again, not a critique of anything in the video that I've seen yet, but more a general commentary, is that people will say, this thing is intrinsically valuable, not as a weighty philosophical qualifier, like intrinsically valuable versus not intrinsically valuable, but as a sort of, I want to say like a weasel word, but often it's used to mean something like it's genuinely valuable or truly. It's like a matter of, it's a matter of emphasis. And so you might see a realist say something like, look, I think that human happiness and human flourishing is intrinsically valuable. You think it's merely subjectively valuable. And there's an implication that there's something better about intrinsically valuable values relative to like non-intrinsically valuable values. And I think that gets smuggled in under the radar in a lot of these discussions in a way that I think does some rhetorical heavy lifting in a way that isn't really carried through by the substantive philosophical claims being made. And so I want to flag all of those things because I would bet a lot of that is at play in this terminology, or at least the way the audience receives the terminology, even if a philosopher is being careful.
All right. With that, we'll go to the next timestamp.
Being is a person. But even if you didn't believe the unborn were persons, you can even sidestep the personhood question. Because you could ask this question: why is death bad? Why is it bad to cause the death of an infant or the death of you or me, but not bad? Most people agree it's not bad to cause the death of like a pig. Even vegans usually don't treat the death of a human infant like the death of a pig. So why is death bad? I think most people agree that death is bad because it's deprivational. It deprives us of something. It's bad when humans die, not because they have necessarily a desire to live. Animals don't, like infants don't have that. But what makes death bad for humans is it deprives a human of unique experiences.
All right. Yeah, I had this timestamp because I was interested in a citation for this. And I know that you often talk about the kind of claims, empirical claims, psychological claims of general people that philosophers make to support their points. So I didn't know if you wanted to say anything to this.
Maybe I missed something there. Was this a claim about what other people think? Did I miss something?
Yeah, we can replay it, but I thought he said it was ambiguous. I don't think you were crazy, but we'll replay it. But it sounded like he was talking about why most people, in fact, dislike death or think death is bad, rather.
Let's replay the first part, like that, whatever part of that where that might come up, because
Okay.
that would be interesting to see if a psychological claim is being made.
Why is it bad to cause the death of an infant or the death of you or me, but not bad? Most people agree it's not bad to cause the death of like a pig. Even vegans usually don't treat the death of a human infant like the death of a pig. So why is death bad? I think most people agree that death is bad because it's deprivational. It deprives us.
Most people agree.
Most people agree. There's the most people agree.
There we go. So that may be true. But here's the interesting thing about this. What you'll often see, and this is something that I've emphasized a bazillion times on this channel, is that philosophers routinely make claims about what most people agree to, or what most people think, or what they mean when they say things, or what kind of judgments they make, or what implicit presuppositions underwrite the kinds of judgments and statements that they make outside of philosophical contexts. And so philosophers, in fact, many times will explicitly say things like, the ordinary person means to say this, or most people think this. And the thing about all of these claims is that they are empirical claims. Now, does that mean that we need rigorous, super, hardcore quantitative psychology to address every single possible claim a person might make about human psychology? Absolutely not. So, if I said something like, generally speaking, people prefer to eat ice cream over, jumping into a volcano or eating garbage or something like that, I don't think we need to do a study on that, because we know enough generally about human psychology to know that most people prefer to eat ice cream over eating garbage. But people will make claims like this, where it's not at all obvious to me that deprivation is the primary reason people are concerned with death. I'm not sure that people have principled reasons for being concerned with death. I'm not sure that if you ask people that they would give this sort of answer. I don't really know. What I will flag, though, is that people will make empirical claims where I don't think that you could just help yourself to the presumption that the answer is obvious. And then they will leverage those empirical claims for which a reasonable person could question the claim, and for which they rarely present any empirical evidence or any particularly strong reasons at all. They then leverage those to make philosophical points. And this is one of those cases. And this is really, ubiquitous in ethical discussions, but in philosophy more broadly, not necessarily every area. Maybe in philosophy of mathematics or philosophy of physics, folk psychology is not a big deal. Like it's just not that relevant to what you're doing. But when it comes to ethics, it very frequently is. And what's really frustrating about this is that philosophers will frequently make sweeping or broad psychological claims, but then philosophers will also posture as though the methods that they're using, empirical claims, are just not that important. We're engaged in a priori reasoning. This is pure a priori thinking or whatever. And there's sort of fundamental failure to realize that there's a consistent overlap with psychology when you make claims about what people think. And this is very common in ethics. I'm repeating myself a bit, but one thing to note about this, well, I think I don't want to get in too much of a tangent with getting into that, but I guess what I would say, just to sort of summarize the general concern here, is that philosophers, they will often engage in psychology without an explicit appreciation for the fact that they're doing so. And one of the things you'll hear from philosophers is they will frequently talk about scientists who are critical of philosophy. They'll say, well, look, if you're going to go do science, you're doing science with or without any explicit awareness of the philosophical presuppositions involved in what you're doing. And so as a scientist, you can either explicitly do philosophy or you could ignore it and you're doing philosophy anyway. You're just doing it badly. But the same applies to philosophers. When philosophers say things that intersect with psychology or the empirical sciences, they can either engage with that empirical research and take it seriously. They could do psychology or be aware of psychology and do it well, or they could ignore it and do it badly. And I think that that's a serious concern.
Yeah, and then we're not going to watch it, but I think Destiny brings up the point. Suppose someone is having some kind of heart attack, and let's just stipulate that they will die from the heart attack. Wouldn't we disapprove if someone just shot the person in the spot? I mean, what are you depriving them of? Exactly. And I think that kind of woke me up to this presumption that this is what people are like. They just are against killing other people on the basis of depriving some kind of future. And I think, I mean, I maybe I'm doing the same thing here, but it seems like I at least would disapprove of such killings, even though the person will imminently die from their heart condition or whatever. But so that gets you thinking about what the motivation of making this kind of generalization in the context of this debate. But yeah,
it's a good point. It's an interesting thing. I frequently fall into the habit of getting so meta on things I don't even follow through on the obvious commentary. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with speculation on possible alternative reasons why a person might think something like death is bad. And I think you raise a good point. I think it's very reasonable to think that if you gave people a thought experiment where you describe a scenario where a person's going to die anyway, and then a person just comes in and kills them, legally speaking, I think the person would still get charged with murder. I don't think if it went to court and the jury is listening to it and they're like, well, the person was dying of a heart attack, so it doesn't matter that the person opened fire and shot them 10 times in the face, screaming, I hate you, before they killed them. I don't think people go, oh, well, they were dying anyway, so it's irrelevant. Who cares? Now, arguably, the people might be thinking things like the kind of person that would do this is something that we need to keep, we need to deter them from doing this in the future. We need to prevent them from harming other people. So there might be reasons why you would be concerned about that person's actions independent of the fact that they killed a person. But I think people would see the death as bad, as like a wrong occurred. But again, this is psychological speculation. We could ask people, but I think it seems pretty reasonable. There's also, you have to be careful about thinking that, people will sometimes say the reason that people think this is as if there's one reason. Some other reasons death might be bad they might not be the primary reasons, but if someone dies, it could be bad for the people around them. It could be bad for the world. It's not just that person is deprived of experiences, but also that their death can deprive others of various sorts of goods. So that is relevant, even if it's not exhaustive of the reasons why a person's death could be a bad thing. So there's probably a number of factors in play. I also would want to stress that people might think that people dying is bad and not necessarily have some principled reason why they think that it's bad. I think another mistake philosophers make is to suppose that our judgments are driven by implicit principles or implicit philosophical views. So people find death bad, generally speaking. And then what is the reason? There's got to be a rationale. Maybe people just find it bad. Like I don't think about like a food that you like I like, I don't know, vanilla ice cream. If someone said, what's the reason why you like, I'd be like, it tastes good. Like I don't have a principled reason why it tastes good. It just tastes good. And it could be that certain types of aversive experiences, people think they're bad. They don't need a principled reason for them.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of going back to Trent's initial statement about value was that you're valuable because of what you are, not what you do. I mean, the analysis that I like to use about my own values is that they're caused, and we can talk about what causes my desires, what causes my preferences. Sometimes I'm aware of what causes them, not all the time, though. So a lot of this, like, why is death bad or why is pizza taste good, right? I think that too often we ignore the narrative explanation, the causal explanation, when I think that does matter. I think it does matter, and it's often ignored. They opt for some kind of either a priori or some kind of extra metaphysical stuff to the natural facts that we're aware of about pizza or death or whatever, right? I think that we need to make room for conversations about what causes people to value things. And I'm fine with, an anti-realist would be completely fine with saying that depriving someone's life might cause, that thought of depriving someone of a bright future can cause people to disvalue death. But I think that's a very different thing than that's what makes makes the statement true. In some kind of like metaphysical sense, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. But yeah. So shall we go on?
Move on to the next thing?
Yeah. Okay.
View that, well, it's consciousness that matters. I don't think it works. And if you bracket it to say, oh, I'm talking about human consciousness, then I think it gets arbitrary.
I would agree to some extent that it gets arbitrary, but arbitrary in only the ultimately skeptical sense of like all morality absent a religious justification can arguably be arbitrary. So I can half agree with you there, but I think we both probably agree that the human conscious experience is significantly altered or different than the animal conscious experience. I have had some people bring up the argument that like,
let me rewind a little bit more because maybe I missed. Did we get enough context there, or do you think we have enough to roll with?
Well, I might say something about the arbitrary thing, but do you have stuff you want to comment on? I got it, so I don't have much more to say other than to comment on the arbitrary.
Yeah, that's what this is about. Is there's this charge, especially when there's a charge against certain types of anti-realism that if it's a matter of stance, if it's a matter of preference, it's just suddenly arbitrary. And I'm not so sure how that's being used. Obviously, I mean, the last time I had a debate about this, I offered my stances, I offered my preferences on a particular issue, and the charge was that they're just, well, if it's preference, it's just arbitrary. And I asked, well, do you think that your preferences for, let's say, eating a pizza rather than eating like garbage, right? Do you think that's arbitrary? And they said no, right? And they wanted to establish that there was some kind of relevant disanalogy there, which I didn't really see. So I really don't know how these people are using the term arbitrary, other than that it's kind of linked to universality. I guess that if some moral fact isn't true in all cases, or if it can change, I feel like that's what they might mean by arbitrary. But I would want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, first, was Destiny conceding that that anti-realist views suffer from this arbitrariness problem?
I don't think it was about anti-realism specifically. It was about his position on he thinks that conscious beings, or at least conscious human beings, are.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just mean sorry. I'm in metaethics mode. I mean, is there a concession that arbitrariness is a concern in this particular case?
I don't think he addressed it as I don't think he regarded it as a concern. But
can you play that again?
Yeah, we'll play it again.
I was listening to you, and
yeah.
Let's just
view that, well, it's consciousness that matters. I don't think it works. And if you bracket it to say, oh, I'm talking about human consciousness, then I think it gets arbitrary.
I would agree to some extent that.
Do you continue?
No, I think that's good. So, but he's saying he agrees to some extent. So let him finish the thought.
It's arbitrary, but arbitrary in only the ultimately skeptical sense of like all morality absent a religious justification can arguably be arbitrary. So I can half agree with you.
Yeah,
there,
that does not sound like a concession to me. It just sounds like he's saying, yeah, it's arbitrary in the same sense things are generally arbitrary on these.
Yeah, but he added the caveat that a religious justification wouldn't be arbitrary.
Yeah, so I mean,
I don't see why.
Right. And this is the thing that you'll see when theists use the moral argument. There seems to be the presumption from many theists that they get to have moral realism for free. Like, God exists, I'm a theist, I get my moral realism. And now you have to do all this work to show how, if you do think you could have moral realism without God, how you could possibly manage to do that. And, if you don't think you don't think moral realism is true, then they're going to raise a separate set of issues. But there seems to be this weird, like they start the discussion with this presumption, theism, realism comes for free. And if not, you have a lot of work to do. But they have work to do too. How does theism get you realism? It's not, so there's a weird presumption there where it's not at all clear that theists are entitled to the presumptions that they enter into these arguments with. And I think you have something similar going on here where I think Destiny is being a little too concessive there and presuming that, okay, well, on my view, there's going to be this arbitrariness, and maybe on your view, there isn't arbitrariness. But oftentimes, one, it's not clear that that's true or that you should readily grant that. There might be ground to push back on. And two, sometimes the issue with positing theism is that it's just going to push the arbitrariness up a level. This is a constant dispute that I have with proponents of theism that seem to be appealing to God's stances as what makes the moral facts true. And then they'll want to say something like, well, why can't we just make them like, sometimes you'll see people say stuff like, well, it's independent of human stances. And that's really weird. Like humans specifically, like what if there's aliens from another planet or an AI says that it's wrong? Is that realism then? And it's clearly it's not human. So maybe they mean something like finite beings or something like that if we want to be charitable. Because presumably they don't mean like literally like humans specifically. But like, finite beings, not godlike beings. But that just seems to me to be like a terminological dispute. Sure. Okay. So you could cordon off God and leave that out. Anyway, I don't want to get too ahead of myself here. It's just that I'm worried that people make concessions to theism in general too readily. And in this case, it looks like it might be being made too readily. But the real issue here that is of interest to me is this claim about arbitrariness. And you will see this claim that anti-realists have to deal with this distinctive problem that on their view, on their view, certain sorts of considerations are arbitrary. Like if you're just going to ground your motivations or the facts that you endorse in your values or in people's values generally or whatever, that there's something arbitrary about those values. I think that your food analogy is awesome. I like to use food analogies myself. I'm not sure if I would have mentioned that in this context, but yeah, if you try to unpack what's meant by arbitrary, I think that this is again a case of a possible sort of I'm not sure that it's an equivocation because it's not like they use the term one way and then they use it in another way, but rather they're using a term that could mean a range of things, some of which would be bad and some of which might just not be objectionable at all. And so one of the things about saying, oh, your values are arbitrary is there may be an implication that there's something whimsical or unstable about them. So, if the mere fact, and people will make this charge against subjectivists about morality and anti-realists more generally, is they'll say stuff like, well, look, your opposition to murder is this really flimsy thing. It's just based on your subjective preferences. If you woke up tomorrow and you had different subjective values and suddenly you valued murdering people, then you would be okay with murdering people. Like, look at that. There's something arbitrary about your values. And the arbitrariness may relate to there's something contingent about it. There's something unstable about it. There's something changeable about it. There's a lot of possible implications about why this kind of arbitrariness is undesirable and why it's bad. I don't know if that's supposed to be implications of the arbitrariness or that those characteristics constitute the arbitrariness. What's strange about this is that this is again a case like intrinsic where people will just say it's arbitrary and then people will go, no, it's not. Yes, it is. And they're just not clear on what the hell they're talking about. Arbitrary in what sense? What exactly does that mean? Because my values aren't whimsical. I don't just go, yeah, I don't feel like killing people now, but if I did, I would. And like, maybe I'll just go, maybe I'll just go steal and lie suddenly. I'm not like that. One of the things I want to stress here, though, is that there's an asymmetry that's very rarely spoken about, which is that you could always make the parallel claim to the realist. And here's how that works. What I often point out to realists is that I only act in accordance with my own goals and values. Whatever the stance-independent moral facts are, if they're not somehow intrinsically motivating, which I find to be an incredibly questionable claim in the first place, if they're not intrinsically motivating, and I have the kind of accuracy and reflection of my own values and motivational profile to know what I would do under different counterfactual circumstances, I could be pretty confident that if the objective moral facts, were we to discover them, like there's a machine that tells us what the objective moral facts are, and they say things like torture all the babies or kill puppies or something. Yeah, I'm not doing that. I don't want to. And so if the objective moral facts are inconsistent with my goals and values, I'm just not going to do them. Like I endorse a view of motivation where I only act in accordance with my goals and values. And I just don't value doing what's objectively right or wrong, independent of whether it's consistent with my goals and values. I'll only do it if it's consistent with my goals and values. And so my actions are insensitive to what the supposed moral facts are. They're only sensitive to my goals and motivations. That's the only thing I'm going to do is my goals and motivations. So if the moral facts are different, I will not comply with them. If it turns out God comes down out of the sky and says realism is true, kill babies. Yeah, no, I'm not going to. I'm not going to do it. Like God says kill babies like for fun. Like there's not like kill these 3 babies or I'll kill 1 million babies. Like then, there might be situations where the alternative of not doing something is even worse. I'm not talking about that. Now, so what the issue is that while it might be true that an anti-realist's values or like their actions are contingent on their goals or their motivations, and those are in a certain sense changeable, it's also technically true for the realist that their actions are not motivated directly by the moral facts. They're motivated by their beliefs about what the facts are. And the moral realists are not infallible. They are fallible, and their moral beliefs could be incorrect. And so if they are claiming, hey, what I do is I try to comply with whatever I believe the moral facts are, then there's a certain type of contingency that they are subject to that I'm not. Now, I wouldn't call it arbitrariness, but there's a contingency. What if they come to believe that God wants them to torture babies and they're motivated by what they believe the objective moral facts are? Then they're more likely to torture babies in a way where I'm not. And the same holds for all of their other actions. And so one of the things is realists try to act like anti-realists have this like unstable thing where they might act in accordance with their values and their values could change. And so you never know if the anti-realist is going to wake up tomorrow and suddenly be a murderer. But the exact same is true of any realist that's motivated by their beliefs about the objective moral facts. If they come to believe the objective moral facts require them to murder, then they might do it. And here's the thing. It's not at all clear which set of psychological characteristics, beliefs, or values is more unstable. I actually suspect it's beliefs. Now, the beliefs might have to be mediated through values and motivations in a certain respect. But for me, my values are fairly stable. I've liked pretty much the same foods most of my life. I don't have whims where suddenly I'm okay with murder. It's not like once in a while I wake up. It's not like food preferences where sometimes I want chocolate ice cream, sometimes I want vanilla ice cream, and then every once in a while maybe I want pistachio ice cream, right? My moral values aren't like that. I don't just every once in a while feel like murder is okay for a few days. Or I'm like, you know what? Stealing for fun is okay. My moral values are actually fairly stable. Whereas, it's not at all clear that the realists' moral beliefs about what the objective moral facts are actually that stable. I mean, they are subject to argumentation and persuasion in a way I'm not. You can't persuade me to not like vanilla ice cream if it's just a fact about my psychology that I do. And likewise, I don't like torture. You're not going to convince me torture as an end in itself is a good thing. There's no argument to be had. So in a certain sense, I'm less corrigible than a realist is, because if the realist says, I do whatever the objective moral facts are, and it's possible that it's like morally good to torture people, then they might listen to an argument saying, actually, technically, yeah, you got to torture people in a way where I wouldn't. And so there's a contingency on their end that it creates there's a symmetry there. And it might actually be that the realists' attitudes are more unstable than the supposedly arbitrary anti-realist values. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a good response. Also, this is a question I posed to Dr. Mike Humer on my channel when I interviewed him. There's the normal retort is that you just wake up tomorrow with very different values, and suddenly everything is justified. All the things that you take now to be unjustified, they're now justified. And but I don't see why this couldn't happen with the objective or the stance independent facts, right? So your concern, or what you were responding to, is okay. Well, what about our commitments, our beliefs and values? Well, they're actually more stable than perhaps these other realists that have these intuitions or these beliefs about what the objective moral facts are. Well, what about the objective moral facts themselves? They could just change tomorrow. I don't see why they couldn't. So let's say there is some objective moral fact that I don't know, you shouldn't eat puppies or something like that. I don't see why that couldn't change tomorrow. And so what are you going to do if you find out with your objective moral fact detector, when you find out that it changes? Or is that going to, again, kind of the same kind of response you give? Is that, are your motivations and values are going to just fluctuate with the changes in that, weird objective moral fact realm? It seems impossible.
Yeah, and so the realist might want to add characteristics to their conception of the nature of the moral facts. They might say that they're necessary or something like that, and that could get them out of this problem. But that's adding extra characteristics, and arguably there are theoretical costs to doing that. It's a much stronger claim to say that there are stance-independent moral facts, to say that there are necessary stance-independent moral facts. And so the distinctive content, the normative content of the stance-independent moral facts is in a certain sense fixed or logically necessary or something like that. They're welcome to make that sort of claim, but there's extra work to be done. And, it's one thing to say non-philosophers have realist intuitions. Do non-philosophers have realist necessary intuitions? Do they not only have the intuition that torturing babies is stance independently wrong, but that it's necessarily stance independently wrong? I mean, that starts to really raise serious questions about the plausibility of the claim that the remarks that they're making are intuitive,
let alone the coherency. Because
Sure.
to say that they're logically necessary, that we're deducing these from like base first principle logical axioms or whatever, like that's, like you said, there's work to be done there. But if they're taking a step back from, okay, we're not talking about some kind of logical necessity, we're talking about some other kind of modality, well then there's just a question of what's being talked about. But yeah,
there's going to be, regardless of what extra characteristics they want to add to, like basically if they want to avoid this potential concern, all else being equal, nothing about the notion of a stance independent moral fact makes it the case that it's unchanging. That's not a property of being stance independent. In principle, like the natural laws could change. There's no rule that says that the speed of light has to stay. Is there? Like, as far as I know, there's no logical rule dictating that. Is there?
no logical, not as far as
Not
I
that
know.
I'm aware of. And so the moral facts could change. It's in other words, it's not a feature of the mere fact that a moral fact is stance independent, that it is also unchanging. And so if you want to say it's unchanging, okay, then you get to say, hey, my belief in unchanging facts is better than your belief in possibly contingent facts because they're unchanged. Okay. I mean, you could do that, I guess, but do keep in mind, my concern that I'm raising is not about whether the facts themselves change, but about the fact that it's what's operative in the realist's behavior is not the facts themselves, unless they actually think that the moral facts, like they are a puppet on morality strings and they just comply with whatever the moral facts are. That's not what happens. Those facts have to be mediated through their beliefs. And so it's actually their beliefs that are relevant here. And the bottom line is the realist's beliefs about what the moral facts are. In fact, even their beliefs about which moral facts are necessary is itself contingent. And is so long as a person's actions are mediated, in the case of the realist, through their beliefs about what those stance-independent moral facts are, they are subject to this contingency. Unless they somehow think that their beliefs about what the stance-independent moral facts are functionally irrelevant to their behavior, that seems profoundly bizarre and super implausible. And I don't think realists would really try to defend that. If they did, that's already a win because that's a reductio. That's absurd. So moral, like their belief, like in other words, it's presumably the case that a moral realist that believes it's wrong to murder people, that it's their belief that's wrong to murder people that's doing some of the work in their restraint from not murdering people. Now, if it's not doing work, then we've got another problem for realists, which is that beliefs about stance-independent moral facts are functionally inert. They don't do anything. So that's one problem. The alternative is that they do something, and then they're subject to this contingency concern. And then there's asymmetry in the degree of contingency and instability in their own views. So I don't think these arbitrariness charges really, they don't do much work, because the anti-realist can present a parallel concern that is either going to require the realist to do a whole philosophical dance to try to get out of the problem, which is going to saddle them with additional problems, or they're just going to be subject to a similar concern, and it's not going to make much dialectical headway.
Yeah. Well, this next segment is about 8 minutes long. They exclusively talk. This is a metaethical discussion that they're having here. So, my advice is just to tell me when to pause when you feel like there's something that needs to be said, rather than watching.
Okay, I'm gonna take a quick break while we do that, and so I'll be listening, and then I'll be running back.
Okay,
right?
I'll go ahead and play it.
All right, sounds good.
That negative right afforded to us. So as long as all of us are humans, as long as we're all social creatures and we've all got some agreement to live and work and exist with one another, that negative right to life ought to be protected at all stages of when a person exists.
So it's like a social contract.
Essentially, yeah.
Would a society be incorrect if the social contract included all biological human beings, so every human embryo or fetus?
When you say correct or incorrect, what do you mean by that?
Would it be a morally bad or evil contract? For example, 150 years ago, there was a social contract that said some human beings could be enslaved, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout most of human history, social contracts have excluded certain groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
Were the social contracts in those societies immoral?
So immoral is kind of, in a way, begging the question of which moral system we're using. Obviously, insofar as theirs were concerned, it wasn't. For me personally, I don't believe in any sort of like moral realism. I don't believe in any kind of like moral fact. So I don't think I could evaluate from some objective frame of reference, this thing is absolutely morally correct or this thing is absolutely morally incorrect. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that we have any organs to allow us to perceive any sort of moral fact in the world. So I think that moral systems are invented by people. I think that we all have kind of shared intuitions. And so when we're writing like any kind of moral system, I think what we're doing is we're kind of leaning into the intuitions that people have, and we're trying to write rules explaining kind of why people feel the things they do. As an analogy to that, did you ever take any musical training?
Yes, I was in the 7th grade and I was an idiot. And instead of picking the guitar, I picked the trumpet.
Okay.
It turns out girls like the guitar more than the trumpet. But...
True. So for music, there's something called music theory, which is a theory of explaining how music sounds away to a certain person.
Right.
A music theorist can't write and say, this is going to sound good to you. All a music theory person can do is say, well, these things tend to sound good. Let's figure out the rules for.
All right.
Yeah, a couple quick comments. I don't want to do like a long monologue again, but notice that use of the term absolute. And so flag there that it's not clear what absolute means there. Is that a reference to exceptionless moral rules, or is it a reference to stance independence, or a reference to something else, or is it indeterminate? It's not clear. I don't want to get into this now, but there was that interesting comment about like an organ for detecting the moral facts. I do think that there's something interesting to be said about that, because I'm not convinced that any information that is like stance independently true has to be directly mediated by a sensory organ. You know, let's say that we are not going to be some kind of like an anti-realist about scientific facts. Are all of our scientific facts do they have to be directly mediated by an organ? Probably not. And so the mere fact that there isn't a like moral detection faculty or organ, which it doesn't, as far as I know, there's zero evidence that there's anything like that, is not in and of itself going to just sort of end the case for detecting moral facts. But there is, I think, a hint at something really interesting there, which is that many, especially non-naturalist moral realists, do appear to have a psychologically underdeveloped case for claiming that they have some sort of capacity or faculty for detecting moral facts. And there are even people that defend accounts of moral perception, and they will argue that we, in a certain sense, perceive moral facts. You'll also see realists use metaphorical language, like they'll say that we see the moral facts, and that's fine. There's nothing fundamentally wrong. Like I could say that I can see that 7 is a prime number. Like, that's not a ridiculous or incoherent remark, even though I'm not literally seeing primeness. Like, primeness isn't a visual property of things. I don't have a problem with that metaphorical language, but when you do use that metaphorical language, that is a check that you should be able and willing to cash. If someone says, hey, it's like a check that you hold in reserve. If you say, hey, cash that check, what exactly do you mean when you say you see the moral fact? You need to tell us something about the phenomenology or the epistemology, like what is going on there. How are you detecting them exactly? And I don't think realists really develop this case very much. And again, I especially mean non-naturalist realists, where they'll say, oh, well, it's an intuition, it's an intellectual seeming. And they just don't do I think that they just haven't done adequate work to show that the kinds of claims that they're making, which, notice again how this is brushing up on human psychology, this doesn't really intersect very well with the relevant psychological research and like research in human cognition to really show that there's these special types of psychological faculties and that they're operative in these cases and not these other cases, that they rely on distinctive mechanisms in the brain, that these mechanisms tend to be reliable. Like, there's just nothing that would indicate that any of this has been developed or fleshed out as a sort of substantive psychological theory of the underlying mental processes that are involved in these sorts of judgments. And yet they'll make these claims anyway. They see the moral facts, they perceive moral facts. How, why, there's not a good story that's being told there.
There was something also, a rhetorical question I had, or insight, and I'm hoping I'm getting to. So let me play it, and then I'll give you my thought on on the exchange.
That negative right afforded to us. So as long as all of us are humans, as long as we're all social creatures and we've all got some agreement to live and work and exist with one another, that negative right to life ought to be protected at all stages of when a person exists.
So it's like a social contract.
Essentially, yeah.
Would a society be incorrect if the social contract included all biological human beings, so every human embryo or fetus?
When you say correct or incorrect, what do you mean by that?
Would it be a morally bad or evil contract? For example, 150 years ago, there was a social contract that said some human beings could be enslaved, for example. Throughout most human history, social contracts have excluded certain groups of people. Were the social contracts in those societies immoral?
So immoral is kind of, in a way, begging the question of.
Okay, so there's something that bothered me here about Destiny's response. First of all, it's not begging the question. It may be maybe the appropriate phrase is raises the question, or that's a loaded question. But that's not why I played this clip. I think that he needs to recognize that there are you can be an anti-realist, you can reject moral realism and use the language of morally bad. If Trent Horn asked me if XYZ is morally bad, right? Yes, I think it's certainly a move to ask him what he means by that, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying yeah, I think it's morally bad. Keeping in mind that as in Lance's terms, his morally bad, his normative language is tethered to something different. So I would have just responded, yeah, that was bad. That was bad. Now, I might have not used the word morally bad, but yeah, that's bad. I think I would understand someone if they were to say it's morally bad. And I would use that language as well. But I think this, so there's a question here. I don't think as anti-realist, we have a handicap in these discussions. I don't think every time when someone asks us, is this wrong? We have to ask them, whoa, stop right here. What do you mean by wrong? Right? Like, I think we could just say it's wrong. And then as the discussion proceeds, if there's some philosophical tension with what that wrongness is being tethered to, then we bring up the metaethical framework or background. And I think it was premature, perhaps in this exchange. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. This is another case where I think that anti-realists are frequently excessively concessive to moral realists. They give up too much ground at the outset. They act like realists have some sort of ownership over language, and the anti-realist has to be really hands off with using ordinary language. look, the bottom line is, and this is what my own research shows, there is no compelling empirical evidence that the way ordinary people speak and think when they say things are morally good or bad or right or wrong or whatever, that they are using language in a consistently and determinately realist way. And so I don't have, it's not like if the anti-realist says, yeah, I think murder's bad, that they're using some sort of weird proprietary language in a way that the realist isn't, because the realist hasn't already shown that there's a presumption in favor of realism. They haven't. And so if they have their metaphysical or philosophically sophisticated account of what they mean when they say murder is wrong, they mean there's an irreducibly normative fact such that you ought not murder independent of your goal, standards, or values, something like that. They don't, why did they get to just say murder is wrong and that's what they mean? But if I say murder is wrong, like I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth, or I'm being deceptive, or I'm using revisionary. I'm not revising the language any more than they are. I don't grant that the language is realist presumptively in the first place. So absolutely, I don't think you should go, what do you mean by good? No, yeah, murder is bad. Helping people is good. Being kind is good. I'm going to use all that normative language. And like you, I may or may not add, I would probably add the moral stuff to it. Because if someone says, hey, do you think torturing babies is morally bad? And I'm like, yeah, it's bad. And I'm like, but morally bad. Yeah, it's morally bad. So you think like, so they're just, it's this constant vacillation between that language, the normative language, without the metaethical presuppositions made explicit, and that language with them made explicit. If I say I think torturing somebody is bad, it does not mean that I think torturing somebody is stance independently bad. And it does not mean that if I say it's bad and I explicitly say I think it's bad but not stance independently bad, that I'm using revisionary language any more than the person that says it's bad and doesn't say stance independently, but that's what they mean. They don't own the language. They don't own the language. So why do anti-realists treat realists like they own the language? Why? I don't get it. And the thing is,
did here.
Yeah, Destiny does this, but even professional moral philosophers do it.
Yeah.
So like Olson does this. Error theorists generally do this. Error theorists get themselves tangled up in all these assumptions about ordinary moral language where they don't have to. And if that means they can't be an error theorist, if it's just a part of error theory to make claims about the semantics of ordinary moral language, stop making the claims, because there's just not any good evidence that they're true.
Which moral system we're using? Obviously, insofar as theirs were concerned, it wasn't. For me personally, I don't believe in any sort of like moral realism. I don't believe in any kind of like moral fact. So I don't think I could evaluate from some objective frame of reference, this thing is absolutely morally correct or this thing is absolutely morally incorrect. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that we have any organs to allow us to perceive any sort of moral fact in the world. So I think that moral systems are invented by people. I think that we all have kind of shared intuitions. And so when we're writing like any kind of moral system, I think what we're doing is we're kind of leaning into the intuitions that people have, and we're trying to write rules explaining kind of why people feel the things they do. As an analogy to that, did you ever take any musical training?
Yes, I was in the 7th grade and I was an idiot. And instead of picking the guitar, I picked the trumpet.
Okay.
It turns out girls like the guitar more than the trumpet. But...
True. So for music, there's something called music theory, which is a theory of explaining how music sounds away to a certain person.
Right.
A music theorist can't write and say, this is going to sound good to you. All a music theory person can do is say, well, these things tend to sound good. Let's figure out the rules for why they do and why they don't. And I believe that morality is constructed in the same way. So I'd be like, probably like a non-cognitivist school of thought under like a moral anti-realism, I guess. So to go back, when you ask me, is something like objectively right or wrong? I don't believe that there is an objective right or wrong. Just like I don't think there's like an objective beautiful or an objective best song or an objective anything like that. Yeah.
So like I would say it's evil to rape someone. It is wrong to do that. And it is a fact that no one should ever do that, full stop. Would you just say rape makes you feel bad, you don't like it, you'd prefer people don't do that?
Yeah, that's essentially the non-cognitivist position, right? Because I don't think you can...
Yeah.
You want to stop here?
Yeah. So notice the remark where again there's and this is coming from a philosopher. So it's honestly it's a little I'm a little bothered by that, which is there's not a clear distinction between an action in a moral action being stance independently wrong and it being wrong in an absolute or without exception way. So there is absolutely nothing preventing an anti-realist from saying all instances of torture or all instances of this kind of action and that kind of action, whatever the bad action is, are bad. All of them, without exception. That is completely consistent with anti-realism. Anti-realism is not about context sensitivity or about thinking that an action is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. A moral anti-realist does not have to think that sometimes it's okay to murder people for fun, or sometimes it's okay to torture babies, like provided that like some people want to, then it's okay. That is a very, like that there might be certain forms of anti-realism where that's true, like very specific forms of agent relativism, where you think that the moral facts are fixed for everyone in a way that's relativized to the standards of the agents performing those actions. That might be some type of agent relativism, where if a person thinks it's like good to torture people, then it is in fact good for that person to torture people. But notice, in fact, good in some almost kind of stance independent way. Like it's good in a way where I have to recognize that it's good for them to torture people. But that it's questionable whether that's really a type of anti-realism, because it really seems like you're saying these stance independent facts are fixed by stances. Like you have a stance and then the stance somehow creates a stance independent fact. I like to call that a la carte realism rather than calling it even a type of anti-realism, because if you think that if Alex thinks it's okay to torture people and Sam doesn't, then it is in fact okay for Alex to torture people because Alex thinks it's okay to torture people. Well, okay, in what respect? Okay, relative to Alex's standards? Because if it's only okay relative to Alex's standards, that ends up meaning something like it's consistent with Alex's goals to torture people, and that would just be trivially true if Alex wanted to torture people. But critics of anti-realism will frame their accusations against the anti-realist as though you, the person they're talking to, has to respect Alex's preferences. So if Alex thinks it's okay to torture people, you have to think it's good for Alex to torture people. And that's not true. I don't have to think it's good for Alex to torture people anymore. Like, let's say you really hate pineapple. Danny, do you like pineapple on pizza?
I do not.
Okay, so I actually do. And I'm not lying here. I do like pineapple on pizza. I actually like it quite a bit. So I like pineapple on pizza. Does that mean if you are a relativist that you have to like pineapple on pizza?
No.
But I like it. So you have to think it's good. You
No.
have to think pineapple on pizza is good. Well,
Okay,
you have to
you
at least
convinced-
think it's
you
good for
convinced
me.
me. I like it
You
now.
at least have to think it's good for me, right? But see what it's good for me amounts to. It just amounts to I enjoy pineapple and pizza. That's all you would be committed to. And so all a relativist would be committed to, at least on many forms of relativism, if someone thinks it's good for them to torture people, all they're committed to is that person thinks it's good for, like, they prefer torturing people. They think it's okay to torture people. It doesn't tell you anything about that relativist's attitude towards torture. It tells you literally nothing. There's no normative implications. They're not obligated to respect. If you're a relativist and you think moral facts are relative to the standards of different agents or whatever, or different people, and then you come across a person that's like, hey, I'm about to torture a person, you're not, as a relativist, obligated to go, well, do you prefer or do you value do you think it's morally permissible to torture people? Like, what are your subjective values? And they go, oh yeah, it's my subjective value that it's okay to torture people. And then as a relative, you go, oh, okay, well, carry on then. Nothing to see here. That's ridiculous. You could just say, well, I don't care what your values are. I act in accordance with my values, and I value nobody torturing anybody ever. So now I'm going to stop you. That's completely consistent with relativism. It's consistent with most forms of anti-realism. And there's just this constant insinuation that anti-realists somehow are deprived of various sorts of, like, they can't do certain things, they can't say certain things, and it's just total nonsense. It's just not true.
I don't believe there's a fact to be observed. My challenge would be how do I observe a moral fact?
Well, I just think that we have a sense of observing morality, just like we have a sense of observing the natural world, and it's not the Matrix. We have an intuitive ability to do that, and I have no reason to deny that ability to exist. That ability exists. I just as I know the world around us is real, even if I can't prove that, I know that it's an objective fact that it's wrong to rape children, for example.
So let's say that you had two people and they came together and we were observing the natural world, and two people had a disagreement over if I dropped this cup, will the cup go to the ground or not, right? Do we believe in gravity, essentially? I think that if there was a disagreement between those two people, I think that we can run tests that appeal to our faculty where we can, God damn it, Brian.
There's a motorcycle outside.
Sorry,
the
guys, there's
studio.
been, is it a leaf blower? Or
No,
I don't know
who knows?
what it is.
There's sense data.
So if you couldn't hear it, there was someone mowing the grass right next to the window, and it was really loud for them. It wasn't that loud for us, so he could not hear it. Probably couldn't even hear himself. So that's where that first came from.
Okay. What I like about the point Destiny is making here is it's actually pretty similar to one of the points that I make, which is that there are epistemic differences between certain sorts of claims. Like if you're making like scientific claims, like about gravity, is that there are external means of corroboration that are sort of publicly available in a way that's often not available for the sorts of claims that realists make. And so, that isn't, so, he's pointing out in the case of gravity, if someone says, hey, I don't believe gravity is real, right? You can say, okay, well, one thing that would be, there's predictions that are consistent with gravity being this real phenomenon. And there's ways of falsifying it. And then you could sort of test it. And there would be some external means of corroborating the claims or the predictions that you make on the gravity is real account. And so there's ways of testing that are not reducible to some sort of privately accessible epistemic standards. And that is worth noting. Now, that is not to say that direct empirical observation is the only way to establish claims. That's, I'm not defending that strong of a claim, but there are epistemic asymmetries between scientific claims and certain kinds of philosophical claims that are relevant. And that's at least worth flagging, that's not a bad point that Destiny is raising.
That basically we can acquire from the real world, and then it can, assuming none of us are psychotic or delusional, we can come to an agreement over whether the cup will fall or not. If two of us were to analyze a situation, we can say the rape of kids, because that's a pretty obviously wrong one for most people. But if we go into hairier situations, like say Kyle Rittenhouse defending himself, there's a disagreement there over whether or not you might have a right to kill somebody based on them attacking you. How do you observe the disagreement? How do you reconcile who's right or wrong if there's a moral fact there?
Well, just like in general, let's say there are facts of history. Just because we might disagree about which historical facts are true or not, we might not have access to all the information or make inferences. We can still say that, it was a fact that the Civil War happened, for example, even if we disagree about what exactly caused it or something like that. So when it comes to morality, even if we disagree about the fact that there is disagreement about moral issues, I think that shows there's objective morality. Now,
that's a good point to respond to.
You want to go ahead?
Well, no, actually, you take this one, and I'll add I guess to start, there are different senses of disagreement. I think people can have the same desires, people can have different desires, and people can have what I call conflicting desires or conflicting values. And I think that that's sufficient for me as some kind of subjectivist to account for this sense of disagreement in, say, the political space. So what I mean by different desires, you may desire to be a lawyer, I might desire to be a doctor. Those are different, but they're non-conflicting. We can get both of them. They're not, if one of us succeeds, it doesn't mean the other one fails. But a conflicting desire or value is one in which if one succeeds, the other person fails. So if I want you to be a doctor at some point in time, and you don't want to be a doctor at that point in time, right? If one of us were to succeed, one of us would fail. And so I think that a lot of what goes on is, I think that for me, that accounts for this sense of disagreement, and it's completely compatible with an anti-realist position. This kind of disagreement that they want to talk about is a sense of disagreement I really don't need in my kind of theory of politics, and I'm using that word very broadly. But what did maybe I'm wrong about that? Maybe you have a lot more thoughts to say.
No, I actually think pretty much the same thing. There's philosophers are real weird. So much philosophy is supposed to be based on or appeal to or address ordinary thought and language. And so philosophers will say things like, look, when people have disagreements, this is a good indication that they think that there's some sort of fact of the matter, an objective fact of the matter, perhaps, about the issue in question. A few issues with that. First, technically speaking, let's say you're a cultural relativist and you're in a society of other cultural relativists. Two people could disagree about what the moral facts are in that society, and you're not a realist about those facts. There is, in other words, let's say according to your culture, it's wrong to steal on Tuesdays or something. and one person just misremembers, they think it's Wednesday or something like that, and one person says it is wrong to steal on Tuesday, and another person says it's not. There actually is a fact of the matter about whether it's wrong to steal on Tuesdays relative to that culture's values. Those facts are not stance independently true, and yet you could totally have a disagreement. And you could actually have a disagreement about like what the objectively what the facts are relative to that culture. And so there's a sort of second order stance independence about what is in fact right or wrong relative to that culture, even though once you move down to the next level, or up to the next level, as the case may be, the fact itself isn't grounded in something that stands independently true. It's made true by the standards of that culture. And so already it's just simply not true that if people engage in disagreements or they argue with one another about what the facts are, that the facts themselves must be stance independently true, even explicitly in the case of morality, by simply pointing to the fact that cultural relativists could argue about what the facts are. The same is also true of constructivist accounts. So constructivists can disagree about what the facts are, and they can argue about it. They can argue about the implications of employing a particular constructivist procedure. And so, again, I think that realists just catastrophically fail to appreciate the sheer volume of conceptual resources available to anti-realists for accommodating the sorts of things that I think many realists take to handily favor realism. Now, many of these things, the existence of putative moral disagreement is consistent with moral realism, but it's also not that hard of a fit for various anti-realist accounts. Now, so that's the first thing. But the second thing is that why the presumption that disagreements have to be over what's true? People can disagree about what like to do. And so the example I frequently give, there's going to be lots of pizza examples, I guess, is let's say you and a group of friends want to order some pizzas. You know, you like helped your friend move into their new place. Everybody worked all day. You just want to order some pizzas. You don't want to sit down and cook. So you're ordering some pizzas and you're trying to figure out, oh, well, this person doesn't like mushrooms and that person wants peppers, and this person wants a whole bunch of cheese on the pizza and other people don't. When you're trying to coordinate what toppings to get on the pizzas, there's no fact of the matter about like the correct pizza toppings. That would be an insane thing to think. It's ridiculous. I don't think anyone would really, I mean, maybe some people would. Philosophers will endorse some weird stuff, but there's no particularly good reason to think that what's in dispute is what the facts are. Like you're disagreeing about what the facts are. What you're trying to do is coordinate collective action. And the same thing generally applies to people whenever there's a clash of two or more people that have different sorts of values. It's not that you are disagreeing about what the stance independent facts out there are. It's, hey, I want one thing, you want something else. Let's negotiate or coordinate and try to reach some accommodation. If I'm trying to buy a car from someone, they want to sell it at the highest price possible. I want to buy it at the lowest price possible. We disagree about what the price of the car should be. There's no objective fact of the matter, though, about like the correct car price. Price realism would be absurd. And yet, in that case, there's still a dispute to be had. You can argue $10,000 is totally a reasonable price. No, it's not. That's way too much. This isn't worth a penny more than $8,000. If you saw people arguing like that, I think most of us would say they disagree. They're in a dispute. And yet there is no reason to think that there's an objective fact of the matter. And so one thing that's really weird about philosophers is their almost total failure to appreciate that people can disagree about something other than facts, and that this is really obvious, and that it's very easy to point to cases of this, and that it is not at all obvious when people are arguing about morality that it's necessarily the case that they're arguing about what's true rather than what to do.
As a religious person, I do think there is
Oh no, I totally agree. But we don't want to go over time, so we're almost done with the clips. We have to finish this one out and then one more, and I think we're good.
Ultimately, a universal moral lawgiver, what people might call God, that ultimately explains that. But even if you didn't believe in God, and there are many moral realists who don't, you could believe that. Well, the fact that we talk about abortion, we're not talking about abortion like we talk about sports teams or talk about fashion. Does this look good? Does that look good? That's very subjective. But it seems like when we talk about abortion, we can make moral progress. We can get closer to having a better position. Like, I think America has made moral progress in getting rid of slavery, giving women the right to vote, things like that. But if there were no objective morals, you couldn't call it progress. It would just be change. Just like
if there was no, so the phrase is, if if moral realism were false, there would just be change, mere change, no progress. At least when we look across society, the development of societies.
You want to take that?
Well, I mean, things could progress as according to your stance. It's pretty simple. I don't know.
This is trivially easy. Of course, society has made progress. Of course, I think there's been progress in us getting rid of a lot of bad things or minimizing them. It just progress doesn't need to be understood as stance independent progress. Again, there's this presumption that realists own words. They don't own the word progress. Look, if I get better at cooking in the kitchen, right? So I work, I try hard, I make food, people enjoy it more. Do we have to think gastronomic realism is true to think that you can train as a chef and get better as a chef? No, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And so one of the things to stress about this is that it's trivially easy to point to examples like this where there's no presumption of realism from hardly anyone. And yet there's nothing at all weird about saying you could progress as a chef and that you could get better as a chef. And we're not at all tempted, at least most people, I'm making a psychological claim. I would bet most people are not tempted to presume gastronomic realism as a result of that. These analogies are easy. Gastronomic analogies are easy ones. Price analogies are easy ones. Aesthetic analogies are easy ones, although a lot of philosophers are realists about aesthetics. It's really easy to point out that a lot of the rationales given for presumptions in favor of realism are actually really superficial and easy to knock down. And it's one of the things that I'm of two minds about stressing this. When I say this, I'm not trying to be disparaging of the academic I mean, maybe if philosophy is an institution, but not the individuals. But there aren't any good arguments for realism. The arguments are usually bare bones or really lame. And even when there are superficially more sophisticated arguments, the arguments are typically underwritten by these sorts of buy-ins to certain concepts or presumptions that are highly, I at least think, highly questionable. And they often just recapitulate the same issues over and over and over, like this presumption that there's something substantive about irreducible normativity that we can even make sense of, and they'll just toss that into the argument somewhere. Anyway, just the point is, often the way that the realist-anti-realist dispute is framed is in a way where anti-realists are treated as though they're on the dialectical back foot, that there's something really, really questionable and sketchy. Like anti-realists are depicted as these, like they're like Pennywise, like we're all lurking in the sewer waiting to eat people. And the realists are these noble, glorious, angelic beings with halos and glowing wings, and they fly around healing people, and they're so noble. There's like a weird sort of miasma like around the whole discussion of realism and anti-realism, as if realists are morally better. And it's really weird. And I don't know why that's granted without argument. There's just something really strange about that. And this is why a lot of the work I do isn't to directly address the arguments, which again, I don't think you can technically address the arguments for realism. I actually don't think arguments for anti-realism are typically very good either. I think arguments on both ends are pretty bad. But I actually think that the arguments aren't doing that much work. It's a point that I've stressed before, which is that if you take away all of the sort of formal arguments for moral realism, like Enoch's deliberative indispensability, Cuneo's companions in guilt, Hume's ontological argument, appeals to disagreement, like Trent is using here. If you take all those away, I still think you're going to have lots of moral realists. And the reason you're going to have lots of moral realists is because they find realism intuitive, or they find certain facts that entail realism intuitive. But if you took away those intuitions, I don't think these arguments would get anybody very far. I don't think you'd find that many moral realists. I think that intuitions are doing, or whatever those are supposed to be, are doing almost all of the heavy lifting. And then that heavy lifting is then facilitated by and works to get a lot of the public on the side of realists through framing devices, rhetoric, polemic, and this sort of depicting anti-realism as some sort of nasty, undesirable, evil, like wretched thing, like anti-realism is for gremlins or something. And then realism is depicted as like the noble and genuine view. And realists do this. Oh, well, only we think things are really wrong.
Oh,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you've never really had intuitions for moral realism. Is that correct, Lance?
So part of the problem is that I have very much a skeptical view about the accuracy of human memory. And so, recollections of the past are largely a reconstructive and narratively driven process. We tell stories about ourselves, and those stories are often self-flattering. We may or may not, I don't think that we like suppress facts, but we just misremember. So it's not like it's there, but I don't like, I used to
Well,
be
do you
realistic, I
remember?
admit it. No, I don't remember. So,
Okay,
and
well-
even if I try to draw on a memory, my point here is if someone said you have like what's like the sort of raw phenomenological content of your memory recollections, I would say, yeah, it doesn't seem like I had realist intuitions ever. But the
Well,
bottom line is I
did,
don't know. Maybe I did.
I did specifically. There was a kind of phenomenology I have when I get outraged, especially like this movie I've watched a few times, Hotel Rwanda, that always grinds my gears. It's about the Rwandan genocide. But when I first watched it, you know, I attributed my phenomenology at the time to that to there being moral facts, like as independent from any kind of human convention. And what's interesting is now as an anti-realist, I watch the same movie, I have the same phenomenology, but I don't make the same attribution. So it's really curious. You know, people have, I mean, they certainly have I think there is phenomenology surrounding being outraged and maybe, for lack of a better term, perceiving something to be horrible or horrendous, you know, and I think that that's where it kind of starts, or where the philosophizing sort of starts, is with that kind of what happens when we interact with these sort of events like the Rwandan genocide or something as equally horrible. But I don't know.
Yeah, it is one thing that I do wonder about, which is that sometimes it looks like realists are claiming that they have a distinctive type of phenomenology, and I'm not convinced that they do. It's not at all clear to me that they have certain types of content to their experiential states that I just don't have. I suspect it's pretty plausible that we're experiencing the world in fairly similar ways, but what I think might be going on is that with a lot of philosophical training, I think that philosophers become very adept at this is going to sound bad, but sort of smuggling their theory-laden and philosophical presuppositions into what they take to be the content of the phenomenology. And so they take it to be like a feature of their experience that certain philosophical propositions are true. And they might even say, no, that's not what's going on. I just have the raw, you know, qualia or the phenomenology. And then I infer my position from that. But, you know, I don't know exactly. It might vary from person to person. I think in a sense, people are almost projecting their philosophical commitments onto what they take their phenomenology to be. And then it's sort of echoed back onto them. And then they're taking that to be, no, it's out there. It's not in me. And I'm seeing it. And that makes it so much more plausible. When you're seeing a person do something immoral, like, you know, you see a person kick a cat or something like that, I think it can, if you feel like you're seeing wrongness, I think that can make it a lot more incorrigible and a lot more visceral, that your sense that realism is true is not just this thing emanating from your intellectual faculties, but it's a kind of receptivity to the world around you. It reminds me of those old images of when people were trying to figure out how vision works. And they were imagining that like the eye like shoots little thingies out into the world and then it like comes back to the eye. It's almost like that people are mistaking the content of their own attitudes and feelings and mental states that is being projected into the world for features of the world itself.
All right.
How fashion changes.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, moral progress is begging the question that there is an objective morality, right? In order to make progress, there must be.
There he makes the same mistake, but we don't need to harp on it. But, you know, he's conceding that term to moral realism.
Yeah, there's also the begging the question thing.
Yeah. Well, that too. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think let's get out.
I think the battle for having begging the question be this like distinctive philosophical concept where you're sort of, you know, presuming your conclusion, and that people, you know, sort of colloquially, people have started using beg the question to mean something like raises the question or prompts the question. That battle's been lost.
No, I don't. It's not. We've lost the literal thing. I'm fine with losing that battle, right? But literal and figurative. But No,
You're literally no. You're figuratively wrong right now. You're figuratively wrong. No, we got to reverse it so that figuratively becomes literally.
Oh, I don't want to lose that battle on the race. It bothers me so much. It really
I
does.
think that beg the question that ship has sailed.
Chat, what do you think, chat? Are we lost on that? We need to do a poll, but we'll go ahead and proceed.
Yeah. Oh, can I do a poll? I want to do a poll.
Yeah, you can do a poll while we listen.
All right.
Out of the basement and go back to abortion.
Sure. Well, I do want to say one thing, because you
Sure.
said you can have a disagreement over historical truth. Again, that truth are empirical things. Like I could uncover archaeologically, like some item that disproves or proves another theory. That's fundamentally different, I think, than a disagreement over a moral fact. For instance, two people, a woman says something slightly rude to her husband. The husband strikes the woman to discipline her.
Right.
Two people come together and they say, I disagree on whether or not that's right or wrong. Where is the moral fact? How do you actually determine concretely who is right or wrong? Because for historical fact, the answer is there, right? Somehow there's some piece of evidence you could find to prove, yes, this did happen, or no, this didn't. But for a moral dispute, how do you reconcile that between two different people who disagree?
Well, I think what you would do is you would start with the most basic intuitions that we can see are correct. Like just starting with, you ought to do good and avoid evil.
Guys, the poll is posted. Please vote. Okay, because I think I'm the only one that voted. Oh no,
I
okay.
voted too.
Okay,
I'm not
so
seeing
Lance
anybody
and
else
I
vote.
are the only two votes.
Where did everybody go? I think at one point I saw 40 people in here.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's
about
nice.
20.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're kind of
yeah,
wrapping it up, I guess. But we could just go to the last timestamp if that's okay.
Yeah, can you take it back a little bit, because I was monitoring the poll and I wasn't quite as focused on what I should be, but
they didn't say anything real. I mean, we could listen.
there was something that was said there that was
something.
interesting.
Okay. Let me see.
So
how
take
far
it back maybe like 30 seconds or a minute.
Okay. I'm going back a minute.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, moral progress is begging the question that there is an objective morality, right? In order to make progress, there must be something you're progressing to.
Let's get out of the basement and go back to abortion.
Sure. Well, I do want to say one thing, because you
Sure.
said you can have a disagreement over historical truth. Again, that truth are empirical things. Like I could uncover archaeologically, like some item that disproves or proves another theory. That's fundamentally different, I think, than a disagreement over a moral fact. For instance, two people, a woman says something slightly rude to her husband. The husband strikes the woman to discipline her.
Right.
Two people come together and they say, I disagree on whether or not that's right or wrong. Where is the moral fact? How do you actually determine concretely who is right or wrong? Because for historical fact, the answer is there, right? Somehow there's some piece of evidence you could find to prove, yes, this did happen, or no, this didn't. But for a moral dispute, how do you reconcile that between two different people who disagree?
Well, I think what you would do is you would start with the most basic intuitions that we can see are correct. Like just starting with, you ought to do good and avoid evil. It's wrong to rape and torture someone because it's fun for you. Courage is better than cowardice. And these are just basement level things that people can see are true. Just like we can see the natural world around us, we can see the external world. There might be some colorblind people who can't see it like we do, but that doesn't take away from the objective thing. Let's go back. I want to
wait. I understand we can go back, but I think these parts are pretty important because it's going to inform a lot of this.
Okay, let's put a pin in it, because I want to talk about your view about abortion though, because I think when it comes, I think here's what I think honestly happens in these. It doesn't have to just be abortion. Give me any moral dispute.
Sure.
We'll say is, all right, here's moral issue X. You have your view, I have my view. And we critique, and a lot of the ways we critique each other's views is your view leads to these crazy consequences. Yeah, but your view leads to crazy consequences. So then we kind of say, okay, whose view leads to kind of less crazy consequences? And that may be the more reasonable view we ought to hold. I think that happens a lot in moral discourse.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of this timestamp. But you might have several parts in mind, but the most recent part is what I wanted to talk about. And that was how we reason, how do anti-realists reason with each other when it comes to, what's the right price, or how many toppings on a pizza, or whether something like this political issue like abortion, like how is there a way of reasoning? A lot of realists think that we can't reason about it. If it's just a matter of our stances or whatever, our preferences or whatever, then what are we doing here? The last debate I had on abortion, when I expressed my stances and my preferences and I established them as sort of these are the kind of these are fundamental. I didn't infer to them. They just gave up right there. They said, well, what's the point of you being here? And I'm like, and I just was astounded. I'm like, well, you can see if it leads to some kind of crazy position, you can perform some kind of reductio, you could maintain, you could show that I'm inconsistent. There's, you could give you could do a lot with that. Just because anti-realism is true, or I'm expressing my my stances, doesn't mean the conversation ends.
Yeah, it's strange to think that unless you're a realist, there's nothing to talk about. I mean, imagine you go to buy a car and they say, well, are you a price realist? And you say, no. And they're like, well, there's nothing to talk about. And you're like, but I want to buy a car. Like, that'd be just really strange. You go to a restaurant, you try to order food, and they're like, hold on. Are you a gastronomic realist? No. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Like, I mean, how ridiculous. There's no reason for you to be in the restaurant. You don't think your food's objectively good. Oh, this is a point I wanted to make. I don't even know if I made it in the stream, or I just say this so often, but there's something strange about maybe I referenced it when I talked about intrinsic value. Someone saying that like something is objectively wrong, they often treat it almost like it's like quantitatively more wrong than if you don't think it's objectively wrong. Like, oh, you merely think it's subjectively wrong. That's a qualitative distinction, not a quantitative one. Why are you saying merely? As if it's somehow worse. And so it's a point that I think people can put in their rhetorical arsenal when they draw on the gastronomic analogies, which is to ask people, look, let's say there's a slice of cake. And let's say you like the cake, you eat the cake, you have a certain taste experience, you enjoy it, whatever, right? Presumably most people are going to be something like an anti-realist about cake enjoyability, cake evaluation. If you said, okay, now, if it's possible that gastronomic realism is true, now imagine that it's true and you eat that cake. Is the cake going to taste any different? I suspect the answer would be no. And then there's an equally important question. Is the cake going to taste any better? And again, I think the answer is no. And I think the same applies for if you think subjectively torture is wrong and you think objectively torture is wrong. It being objectively wrong doesn't make it more wrong. Like that. And yet there's a constant implication that the anti-realists' conception of rightness and wrongness is like this shadowy, ethereal, less substantive notion of wrongness. No, it's no less substantive. It's no less real. And I don't even like the idea that realists are, I've even run into people, including professional philosophers, again, that say anti-realism is the view that morality isn't real. What? No, it's not. Anti-realism isn't the view that morality does not exist. Doesn't exist? Morality doesn't exist. Okay, so do nominalists in mathematics think numbers don't exist? Like, so if you draw 4, they're like, it's not there. There's no 4. Fuck you. I mean, it's to say that it's absurd is an understatement and a disservice to absurdity. It's like cosmically nonsensical and ridiculous. Anti-realists do not hold that morality doesn't exist. I mean, they can, but that's not just not what the view is. Anti-realists simply think that there are no stance-independent moral facts. They could certainly think morality is real in all sorts of respects. They could think that there are stance-dependent moral facts. They could think moral beliefs exist, moral psychology exists, moral judgment exists. There's no inconsistency. So that would be one concern. Although I think I got so worked up about that, I lost my train of thought. What was your original point?
No, it was the anti-realists can discuss.
Right.
We could disagree with each other. We can provide arguments. We can do reductios, and that's what now for basically the rest of the video, like I would say 60% of this video, it's them performing consistency tests on each other. Oh, okay. If you think that XYZ is valuable, what about this thing that's not, that you call that, it's not as valuable, not very valuable, but it has XYZ feature, right? That's a legitimate way of making progress, and at least on my view, they do that with each other. So it's just weird for Trent to think that you could only make progress in a discussion if there's or resolve a disagreement, or there could be only genuine disagreement if there's if realism is true, when he himself is using the exact same way that we would express disagreement as anti-realist in a group. So you'll see that, and we're not going to go through it, but that's basically what they do.
Fair enough.
in the majority of the debate.
Yeah, it's another thing that's worth drawing attention to, which is, if let's say you're in the alleyway mugging situation and the mugger shows up to like steal your wallet and kill you or whatever. Do realists have some sort of tactical advantage, like a conversational advantage, insofar as they can honestly appeal to the objective moral facts in that situation? Like it's not clear that they do. Typically, I think in a lot of persuasive contexts, and it's similar to disagreement contexts, the kinds of appeals that realists and anti-realists would make would typically be very similar. We would appeal to the interests, values, goals of the people that are interacting with us. Hey, don't take my wallet because you'll get caught. Don't do this. Wouldn't you feel ashamed? You're going to appeal to what the person cares about. It would be really weird to start saying, but it's inconsistent with some set of facts that you may or may not care about. Right? Now, if they do care about complying with a certain set of facts, and then you could convince them that those facts are in fact the facts because they had some presumably incorrect set of beliefs or beliefs inconsistent with what they take the facts to be, fine. But notice that still is only going to be effective if they're motivated to comply with those facts. And ultimately, it's all going to be mediated by motivations, by what the person is willing or unwilling to do. And at some level, that's typically in practice going to be cashed out in terms of what's in that person's interests. And so one of the things that's a bit strange about realists is that they will posture in a lot of these contexts. Only they can make progress. Only they can engage in disagreement. Only they have the resources for dealing with persuasion. And it's just none of it is true. And often what's so frustrating about anti-realists is that they seem to concede a lot of this ground. Anti-realists will, for instance, it's something that I criticize a lot, is the idea that anti-realism involves biting the bullet. Anti-realists will say, yeah, I bite the bullet. And maybe it's fun to bite bullets, like philosophical bullets. Like you just accept this implication, accept that implication. And I don't think anti-realists should do this. They should say we're not biting any bullets. You don't have any advantage over us. We're not paying any cost in being an anti-realist. And I just don't see that coming from anti-realists in the academic literature or in discussions like this.
Yeah. Okay, this is the last timestamp. It has to do with intuitions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Harming this person.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we don't answer we don't answer the punishment. We don't get the answer of the person question by answering the punishment one first. We answer, is this a person or not, first, and then we figure out everything else. Otherwise, we're working backwards with our intuitions.
I kind of agree, but I would argue that you were working backwards from intuitions as well when you presuppose a human body that exists. When you presuppose a human body that exists without parts of its brain, which I would argue is not even necessarily a human, that you can probably remove enough parts of a person and you ship-a-thesis them into another type of organism. So if you want to work backwards from that, then obviously I'm going to ask you similar questions and work backwards from intuition around our ability to harm people, right? Because I actually think, even though it sounds strange and it sounds like it's working backwards, I actually think it's hitting at the core of the issue. When we think of harming, we think of a conscious experience that's being harmed, that's being hurt, right? If I harm a person, I'm not thinking of poking a person that is a corpse, right?
But people could have massively incorrect intuitions. I remember a scene from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn where Huck, I think it's Aunt Polly, he tells her in the book, oh, there was a steamship that exploded. And she said, oh, did anyone die? He said, no, just a few Negroes. Well, that's not exactly what she said, but you get the point. And Aunt Polly says, oh, good, I'm glad nobody got hurt. So people can have massively incorrect intuitions.
I don't think they can in your world, though, because you told me that you're a moral realist who relies on people's intuitions, and you're saying that any two people's intuitions should be sufficiently similar enough to agree on objective moral fact.
No, that would be on basic intuitions. So
now there's different types of it? Yeah, tell me the different types.
Sure there are. Just to say that we ought to do good and not evil. That's the most basic intuition of the.
We ought to do good and not evil. I mean, isn't that just? I just take that to be some kind of logical truth. I mean,
depending on how they're cashing it out, it would almost sound on my view, like someone saying you ought to do the things that you think you ought to do, and you ought not to do the things you ought not do. Or if we don't want it to make it totally vacuous, you'd say you should do the things you prefer to do, or you're motivated to do, and you shouldn't do the things you're not motivated to do. I might even say that I can't do otherwise. Because like, how am I going to do things voluntarily, choose things that I'm not motivated to do? Like, how would I do it? I don't even know how. It just might mean, on my view, for something to be good or bad, just is for it to be consistent or inconsistent with my preferences, which, ultimately determine what I'm motivated to do, which in turn dictates my voluntary action. So for me, this is going to just bottom out in pretty trivial descriptive claims, or it's going to be really questionable what it even could mean otherwise.
Now, it may not be tautological if good is just you should obey God. That's not a tautology. But then you run into
Sure.
Right. Yeah, that's probably he might mean something like that, in which case, it's not a tautology, but then it just, then you run Euthyphro issues and, because then there's this separate concept of godliness from what you should do for it not to be a tautology. And so then you have a concept external from godliness that is normative in the relevant way, morality or whatever. So I don't want to be so uncharitable as to think, you're just saying something trivial. We probably have something in mind that's not trivial, but then just, there's objections to be raised.
Right. Yeah. I'm happy to grant that too, that it's probably not that something is simply trivial that's being asserted.
Well,
is there any more? Is that it?
No. Well, let's see. Just a little bit more.
That there's just
but that's not begging the question. The things we ought to do are by definition good. A good thing is the thing you ought to do. It's like saying murder is unjustified when murder is defined as the unjust killing of somebody, right?
There are things you ought to do irrespective of the consequences to you, for example. Even if you end up suffering a great deal, in some cases there's things you ought to do or refrain from because it just is good. Things like that. But then, for example, you ought not directly kill an innocent human being. That's just a general intuition everybody shares. But can you kill human beings in war, for example, because you don't mean to, but you're trying to destroy an enemy base? It's going to be a little bit more difficult in the applied cases, but we have the most basic intuition. So for me, if the basic intuition is that we don't kill infants, all right, we don't kill adults, we don't kill disabled humans, we do kill pigs and cows and other non-human animals. Why is that? To me, the only explanation, it cannot be rooted in consciousness.
One thing to flag is it might not feel like a questionable psychological claim to say that we don't kill, innocent, assuming you don't mean a person that doesn't deserve to be killed or a person for whom it would be bad to kill them. Same thing with people say murder is wrong. Well, if by murder you just mean a wrongful killing, wrongful intentional killing or something like that. So setting aside those circularity and triviality concerns, which let's just grant that there's not that mistake being made. Is that true historically, that people don't let's say by innocent people, you mean a person that didn't provoke you. There's not an immediate rationale for killing them. They're trying to kill you, or they're trying if we look at ancient human societies, is it at all clear that they had this view that it wouldn't be okay just to raid a village and kill everybody? Because people did that. Were they raiding a village going, oh, gee, I really think this is morally bad. What I'm doing is they're hacking people to death? Probably not.
Maybe this is an example. What I thought is, well, Trent is a Christian. Jesus, it's a good thing that Jesus died for his sins. Wasn't Jesus innocent? It's a good thing for him to die.
I know that you bring up those logical and inconsistency concerns, and naturally, I'm going to bring up the psychological concerns. You do more of the philosophy stuff. I do a lot of the psychology stuff. But all through history, infanticide is super common. People kill babies. They kill their own babies. They kill other people's babies. There's all kinds of baby killing. There's all kinds of massacres and slaughters. And I don't think it's the case that all the people in these circumstances thought that their actions are wrong. I very much doubt that that's true. And I think that it's rather clear that human moral values and intuitions, if we want to call them that, are pretty culturally malleable, that they've changed a lot over the course of history, and that they're highly subject to cultural change. I don't think it's one of the weird things that anti-realists will sometimes do, where they almost seem like they're on the same page normatively with realists, including theistic realists. So theistic realists might think the law of God is written on your heart, or everybody is created in a way where we have some intrinsic sense of right and wrong. But even anti-realists will often suppose that evolution shaped people with certain types of moral values. And then those moral values happen to be like 20th century or 21st century, like Western ethical values specifically. Like, bullshit. Have they read a history book? What the hell are they talking about? Like, what do they think that like the ancient world had all kinds of people doing all kinds of stuff that nobody would be okay with today, or very few people, a lot, like they wouldn't be okay with today. And what we're to imagine that they had our psychology? Why? Maybe like actually modern society is pretty psychologically idiosyncratic with respect to most of human history, which is not at all to endorse any of it. It's just to say that there's a presumption. Why are people assuming that their moral values are like what generally shared without supporting historical and anthropological data? I don't think it's true. And I mean, maybe it's true, but you got to make a case for it. So it's really weird when people make those sorts of claims.
Because what is the relevant difference between those non-human animals and the human beings? I know you say human consciousness, but there's a difference between human consciousness and a human who is conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I just think that some of these intuitions that you're hitting at, for taking such a solid, I guess, realist position on morality, it feels like we can find, even fundamentally, somebody could argue, for instance, in the animal world, if I think I saw a video of a cheetah where when the babies are born, they lick them, they try to get them to kind of like move, and sometimes the baby can't move, so the cheetah will just abandon the baby and walk away.
Right.
So who's to say if a person says, well, I think intuitively, if a kid can't walk, then the kid isn't entitled to anything. Like if you have to retreat from an area, if you need to go hunt and gather, if a child can't walk, then you leave them. What if somebody comes at you with an intuition like that? Say there's a tribe where those intuitions exist. How do you figure out whose intuition is correct?
Well, we look at how we've come to understand human beings, and there might be really rare cases where you only have enough food to feed certain people.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying.
Are you saying they're killing
they just leave them there? Yeah, they abandon the child.
Why
yeah.
do they abandon the child? Because they're not able to care for the child?
Because the child can't move. So they feel like until the child can move and like acquire resources for itself, the child's not really worthy of participating in the social contract, participating in that tribe. So
Yeah,
up until the child can move,
they're wrong. We would call that barbaric.
Okay, but why? Under what objective ground?
On the objective ground that all human beings have dignity no matter. And in fact, that was the difference in ancient Rome 2,000 years ago. The Romans did place disabled children in the wilderness for them to be eaten by animals. Mm-hmm. And Christians went and rescued them because they recognized all human beings had this dignity regardless of what they can do.
Yep. But I'm asking you, how do you resolve that difference, that disagreement in intuition? I don't think you can. You can say it's wrong or barbaric.
But that's the same thing. You could have somebody who says, look, I think that marriage just means you have 24/7 access to your wife. So
hold on, we don't need another analogy. Just on that example, somebody says if it's a disabled child, if they can't walk on their own, I should be able to just leave it and carry on because the child's never going to be able to walk or whatever. Why are they wrong? That's their intuition. Their intuition points there. The reason why I'm highlighting this because you told me earlier that you made it seem like...
Because then we could use reasoning. We could say, look, when you as an adult, when you get injured, we try to help you out. We don't abandon you. So then there's an example where we might apply moral reasoning to help them see they're being incoherent, for example. Why wouldn't you apply this to someone who's just a younger version of you, for example?
But they'll say, well, I can walk again. What about for disabled children? You said the Romans did this. They left a disabled child.
Right.
And then what if you say to the person, well, you wouldn't want this to happen if you were disabled? And they're like, yeah, that's part of the agreement, actually. If I was disabled, I would expect to be left.
Yeah, I would agree. And like I said, there's going to be cases where people have a consistent, horrifying morality. They're going to end.
Horrifying is absolutely begging the question. I'm not asking.
Yeah, I think it's horrifying to leave children just because you can't stand the sight of their disability and you think they're not worthy because
that
of it.
Might be the case, but
they
might argue that it's horrifying that maybe they come to America and they say
they can kiss my ass.
That's fine, but they say you've got a society where there are people that are able-bodied, that are capable of helping in society. You don't have the medical resources for them, but you're spending billions of dollars on disabled children. They're going to die before they hit 9 years old.
Yeah.
Why do you have homeless people on the street, but you're spending money on disabled children that are going to die in a few years anyway?
Okay, I think the point is made. I don't think Trent did very well in this particular exchange. So it was, again, Destiny, I think this is like maybe even the third time, raised the issue of someone has XYZ intuition. What grounds do you have to say that their XYZ intuition is incorrect on your view? And he struggled. He just struggled, it's not pivoted, but like tried to create a new analogy, brought up examples with the Romans. We weren't getting a straightforward answer. There was there was a particular blunder where he just said, "Well, that's just horrifying, right?" What I don't know what that response was meant for. I think that was begging the question, an actual example of begging the question. But
This is a case where I think Destiny simply makes a solid point, and I don't know if this is because, like, you know, the bottom line is the reason I think Destiny's point is strong here and that Trent struggles is because there isn't a good answer to give in principle.
what he probably has in mind is his theistic backdrop, but I don't think he wants to pull it out here, right? Because he wants to try to argue on secular grounds for his.
Sure, which maybe we could give a point to. If he were to pull out the whole theistic arsenal, he would have more to say there. And so grant to the theists, maybe they have a better story to tell, at least. The secular moral realists that want to appeal straight to realist intuitions, someone like Mike Humer or something, I don't think they're going to have a good case to tell us here. So, you know, if you're a phenomenal conservative and you just say, look, it just seems to me that it's wrong to do this. Okay. And what if it turns out that it seems to an equally a proportionate number of other people that it doesn't seem that way? You know, now your intuitions are not going to be decisive here, or how things seem to you isn't going to be dispositive. We're going to need to do something else. You know, so how are we going to do that? And I don't, you know, that would be one concern. Yeah, I don't think that falling back on just saying, I think what I want to say here is that I suspect that the secular appeal to one's intuitions alone, I think realists just privilege their own intuitions and are hoping nobody has the audacity to challenge the normative claims. And so I could just say, yeah, look, I have the intuition torture's wrong. If you want to say that someone else doesn't, well, but that's bad though, because torture is wrong. Okay, well, if we had a sincere group of pro-torture people, what are you going to say philosophically to show that they're mistaken? If they're presenting all the same realist arguments and then saying, and then also torture is good. And like they could, in other words, you could imagine someone having almost parallel metaethical views and a similar psychological profile. And then the output is, yeah, torture is good. Now, the normative theory, maybe you could point out inconsistencies in the normative theory, but so long as they're consistent, I don't see how you're going to show that they're like, what you're going to do to show that they're making an error.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, this is the last point that he makes. They make a comparison. I think he makes a comparison to mathematics. And then we'll probably end there.
They might be horrified about that. Then my question goes back to you, because you told me earlier that intuition is how we determine moral fact. And what I'm saying is morality is the only qualia, I guess, that exists where we can only reconcile it with arguments. I don't have to argue with you about gravity. I don't have to argue with you about the color of something. I don't have to argue with you about how loud something is. But for moral fact, this is why I believe it's subjective and not objective. You can never reconcile disagreements between two parties.
That's
different
not true.
intuitions.
People do this all the time. C.S. Lewis, the Christian author, gave lots of examples of this, that when people have a disagreement, they'll appeal to universal norms. They'll say, I was sitting in that seat first. It's not fair for you to take it. I helped you with this. You ought to help me with that. When people have moral disagreements, they don't just resort to their mere opinions about the matter or what they like or dislike. Most people appeal to some kind of universal norm to apply, and they assume it to be true for everybody.
Yeah, but people would appeal to those same universal norms in a time period where women couldn't vote and black people were slaves. So what does it say about the appeal to that universal norm? Doesn't seem to be a universal norm they're appealing to. It seems to be, it's actually, if anything, I would argue it's the non-cognitivist position where they pretend to appeal to a universal norm, but really it's, what do I prefer? Because I bet somebody's used that phrase of like, you can't take my seat, that's not fair. But they would say somebody like Rosa Parks should always be in the back of the bus.
Right. And then that's where you have people like Abraham Lincoln, who made great arguments to say, if you think a black person can be enslaved because they have a darker skin than you are now going to be a slave to the person whose skin is lighter than you, and apply the moral reasoning. But about the objectivity, do you think in the past 2,000 years, human beings have gotten better at mathematics and our mathematical knowledge has grown?
Yes.
Okay. So our knowledge of mathematics has grown. We've gotten better at mathematics, and math is objective, right?
When you say objective, what do you mean by that?
We don't determine mathematical truths by a social contract. We discover
math is all
them.
built on systems of logics, right? It's built on tautologies, right? 1 equals 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2. And then from those tautologies, we build out systems of mathematics. But it's a thing constructed with logics. I think a priori, we all have logics in our head, things like non-contradiction,
but it's all
things like identity.
It's all it's objectively true, even if it's built on these axioms.
Objective with respect to systems of logics, yes.
Yeah, but we don't create the systems of logic; we discover them.
I mean, people smarter than me will argue anti-realism versus mathematical realism. I don't know if there's like an objectively correct answer there.
Well, there's a difference between whether the mathematical objects exist or not. That's, I mean.
All right, we'll stop there. What did you want to? Did anything stick out to you?
No, not really. Other than that, I think Destiny's right to be skeptical of the claims. So I think Trent's trying to help himself to certain metaphysical presumptions here that I would not be willing to grant. So,
yeah. Well, guys, this debate, is long. We probably only watched maybe maximum 40 minutes of it, and what we took to be the relevant parts for a metaethical discussion or stream. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's one of the better debates about the issue. So if you want to go check it out, hopefully Lance will post it in the description. I'm sure he will.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, I'll let Lance kind of close out the stream. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. Well, I was also thinking there was a couple people that wanted to ask questions. You're welcome to stick around for that. If you want to head out, you're welcome to do that. Would you mind if I continue answering questions?
Oh, no. Yeah, it's your stream. I do have to go. But
sure.
Thanks for having me on. It was fun. We should do it again sometime. So good luck with the questions.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for being here. And I had a lot of fun doing this, so I think we should do this again.
Absolutely. All right. Have a great night. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yep. All right. So it's just me. And I'm going to go back and answer a couple of the questions that people had posed earlier. So let's have a look at those. Let me go back and try to find those. I don't even know where they are. Give me a second. I don't know where those questions went. There's a lot in the chat. So if whoever asked me questions before, if you're still around, please ask them again. And I'll check those. I think it was a question about, okay. I think I have a sense of where the question was at. Give me a second. Here it is. All right. So Kevin asks this question. You don't think that there is some, quote, bullet in as much as you have to admit that morality is subjective rather than objective? The answer is no. I mean, when you say admit, it's like I'm confessing to a crime or something. Why would admitting, like, why am I admitting that it's subjective? Like if I don't think that unicorns exist, am I admitting that unicorns don't exist? Why would I word it that way? Unless there was a presumption in favor of unicorns. So it's not just that I deny moral realism, and in fact, all forms of normative realism. I deny that there's absolutely any presumption in their favor, that I have to admit that I'm denying them. I also don't endorse moral subjectivism. My attitude towards subjectivity of value is pretty complicated. I think they can be, values can be understood in subjective terms, but I don't endorse, this is often, if you just say you're a subjectivist, taken to imply a semantic claim about what other people mean. So if I think there are subjective values or things can be valued subjectively, that is not the same thing as saying that the correct semantic analysis of ordinary people when they say murder is wrong is that that person intends to say that murder is inconsistent with their moral values. Those two claims can come apart. You can understand morality subjectively without having to think that that is how everybody uses moral language. So I just to stress there, the second claim is often a claim that's part of or constitutive of what individual subjectivism would be as a metaethical position, and I don't endorse that. So don't mistake me for being a subjectivist in the traditional sense, because I'm not. But yeah, I think there's nothing to admit here. It's not like there's some presumption in favor of realism. Okay, so that was one question. I think there's another question that was about non-cognitivism. I'm looking for it. Where is it? Emotivism. Is that, well, whatever. I think someone had asked me about non-cognitivism or emotivism. So traditional non-cognitivist accounts. So non-cognitivism, very roughly, is simply the view that moral claims don't express propositions, and so they cannot be evaluated as true or false. And so the classical two accounts would be something like emotivism, which is the view that moral claims only express some type of non-propositional emotional state or attitude. And so you could kind of do a translation of what looks like a propositional claim. Murder is wrong. And you could say, okay, well, although that looks like a sentence that could be evaluated as true or false, it actually means something like murder boo. Well, murder boo can't be true or false. It's not a proposition. And so you would be an anti-realist on this view if you see moral claims as simply being these non-propositional expressions of an attitude. You could also have some type of universal prescriptivity. And so this very roughly would treat a moral claim. There's more to it than this, but there's various types of non-propositional claims. One could be an emotional expression like yay, and another could be something like an imperative, like don't murder. It's not an expression of an emotion, but it's also not a proposition. If I say close the door, you can't go true. Like it can't be true or false. And so non-cognitivist accounts construe moral claims in these terms. Now, the reason I don't endorse these views is because I'm concerned about what is meant by saying moral claims can't be true or false. Which moral claims? Like all of them? So if this is supposed to be some sort of analytic claim, then I don't know what it's a claim about, because I don't take one moment. I don't take my view of language is that if we're going to talk about moral claims, I'm interested in the claims that people are actually making, like in the real world. So I'm interested in, if we went out into the world, what people intend to communicate when they say things like murder is wrong, or lying is wrong, or that's good, or that's bad, or that courage is better than cowardice, that sort of thing. I take those questions to be empirical questions. And I don't think that there's an empirical fact of the matter about when people use those claims, whether they are committed to or they endorse realism or anti-realism. I endorse metaethical indeterminacy with respect to those empirical claims. And then I just reject the relevance or even the, I just don't think that there's a meaningful question to ask about like the meaning of moral claims as a sort of analytic question that isn't about the communicative intent of speakers. I take moral claims to be behaviors that occur in the real world. And then there's going to be some type of empirical fact about the communicative intent of the speakers who make use of those claims. I don't think that there are any other types of moral claims. You could talk about like a hypothetical moral claim or a moral claim in the abstract, but typically, historically, the way 20th century meta-ethicists have analyzed these claims is that they've decontextualized what I call toy sentences. So they'll take something like murder is wrong and they'll say, well, what does murder is wrong mean? I actually don't think murder is wrong, technically speaking, is a moral claim. Because it's outside of a context. Moral claims I take to be contextualized or genuine instances of an actual event occurring. It's like instances of jumping in the world or instances of riding a bike are like actual instances of riding a bike. The sentence riding a bike is not an instance of riding a bike, right? So if I type riding a bike into the chat here, that wouldn't be an event of a person riding a bike. That's ridiculous. I take moral claims to be these events that occur in the real world. And then there's going to be a fact about what a speaker's trying to do when they make those claims. That's the subject matter I want to evaluate. I don't think there are moral claims outside of those contexts. What the hell are those? And so I just don't think that the subject matter that I take. So in other words, there's a sort of a dilemma here. Either we're dealing with these actual moral claims, in which case I think the question is empirical, and I think the empirical evidence supports meta-ethical indeterminacy, in which case I don't think cognitivism or non-cognitivism is true, because I don't think there's a determinate fact of the matter. If we're not dealing with an empirical claim, I don't know what kind of claim we're dealing with, and I'm not going to endorse a position on that, and I don't think it's relevant to what position is correct or not. So, I don't really think, I think that basically the traditional meta-ethical positions largely strike me as either being predicated on false empirical claims or mistaken presuppositions about how language and meaning work. And this is why I've sometimes said that I'm a quietist about these views. I've had people say that that's not really the best term to use. I don't know what term to use. But if you think that a particular dispute is in philosophy is either using the wrong methods or relying on the wrong presuppositions, and so the questions themselves are ill posed, and when properly posed, the answer is none of the above, whatever you want to call that, that's my view. My view is all of the traditional views are either false, either there's false sort of on the ground about the empirical facts, or they're false because they rely on false presuppositions. It's a kind of meta error theory. You could say that I'm an error theorist about the traditional metaethical positions because they rely on false presuppositions, something like that. So I'm not going to buy into non-cognitivism in any straightforward way. There is an interesting sort of weird sort of way in which I might be closest in some respects to a non-cognitivist position, in that I think an empirical evaluation of the way moral language actually functions in the real world would reveal that it serves largely socio-functional purposes, where the goal of moral discourse is to achieve the social ends of speakers. So I think it largely serves argumentative and persuasive purposes. It's about navigating social relationships, that sort of thing. And as a result of that, you could say that it doesn't function to express proposition so much as it functions to achieve certain kinds of goals. And if me saying murder is wrong, the purpose of that is to get you to not murder or to look good, then it's not clear that necessarily the best characterization of what's going on is that a proposition is being asserted and presented for someone to evaluate. Okay, so that I think answers that question. And then I answered the other question. Are there any other questions to address? So I see here from Griff, in the cognitivism or non-cognitive debate, are you indeterminate? And so I think I already addressed that. The answer is yes. I endorse meta-ethical indeterminacy, which is the view that there are no determinate stances or commitments with respect to realism and anti-realism as a feature of ordinary moral thought and discourse. Okay, I think that's going to wrap it up. I will close out the screen. The stream. It sucks to mess up right at the end. I guess I've just been here a while and I slip up in words. It happens. Okay, so I'm going to close out the stream. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I will ask, I see a lot more people on the stream than normal, which makes me think maybe I should start streaming more during the week rather than the weekends if it's going to get more views. But whether you're new or you've been here for a while, I would encourage you, if you like the content on this channel or you hate the content and you want to hate watch me and talk about how terrible I am or something, to please subscribe, like the video, or dislike it, I guess. So like, subscribe, and I'd love for people to get involved in the comments and post a comment. I think it's great to have a discussion here. I've certainly been trying to build a community. I started a Discord server a couple months ago. So all of that stuff, and thanks so much, and I will catch you all later. Take care.